Hello everyone, my name is Volita Blanche and I'm the Social Impact Hawker from Aurora PSO. Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the Aurora Radio podcast, where we hope to bring you informative sessions that will get you thinking and get you to grow as a person. We're very excited about this venture, and I just want to take this moment to give a shout out to Tarin Rickert, our Vice Prim, who set all of this up. We're very thankful to you. And today we are blessed enough to have Giuseppe and Zander here with us. Firstly, Giuseppe Guarandi, can you please tell us a little more about yourself, where you're from, why you're here?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name's Giuseppe Guarandi, they, them pronouns. I'm currently a honors student now at Stellenbosch, going into journalism. It's been a lifelong passion of mine, so it's very exciting. I'm just an aspiring writer and journalist and pretty girl in general, I'd say. Recently published in the Daily Maverick, served on Ian Drake's House Committee last year, have been doing debating my entire life, far too long some might say, and represent South Africa in public speaking and debating for years, and still do. Just generally passionate about writing, passionate about social justice, and particularly gender issues, queer issues, and radical feminism. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Zander, could you please tell us a little more about yourself?
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Zander. I use he, they pronouns. I'm a third year BA social dynamics student, which is a fancy way of saying humanities. I'm vice chair for Amnesty International, and I'm extraordinarily passionate about, extraordinarily passionate about queer issues, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental issues and environmental justice. Yeah.
Okay, so as you can see, we've got two very well-rounded speakers here. So as an introduction, Giuseppe, would you please just mind explaining to us what unconscious bias is, what that entails?
Sure. So I'm going to preface this by saying that everything that I'm going to talk about now in terms of my knowledge and expertise on the subject of unconscious bias, I owe a huge part of that to what my dear friend Ayabonga Sitole taught me with regards to this. She introduced me to the topic and contributed largely to a presentation that I offer around this topic, around campus and so on. So shout out to her. This is all very much due to her hard work. I think definitionally when we talk about unconscious bias, it really just has to do with the mechanics of retaining information, but particularly outside of your frontal sort of conscious level of thinking, right? So it has to do with everything that's simmering and existing below the surface. And what comes from the information that you retain in those parts of your brain and sections of consciousness is relatively unknown to us, which is quite scary. And particularly on the subject of the biases that can exist in that space of your brain, a whole lot of problematic stuff that you have taken from society around you, taken from the media you consume passively often and not to your awareness, will get stuck in that part of your brain. And oftentimes very problematic biases in terms of stereotypes, certain prejudices and so on, can linger there and get stuck there, and then manifest outwardly in terms of your unconscious bias coming to the forefront. And that's when unconscious bias starts to become problematic. So yeah, I think from a definitional level, it's all those biases, all of those problematic things that we learn from the moment we're born, really, but passively learn, not consciously, that then get stuck in our unconscious minds and will come to the forefront when we maybe don't expect it. That's more or less what it is.
Okay, so in simple terms, you can develop a bias through observation without even realizing that you are starting to build a bias towards a certain personal group.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's so scary and why it's something that I'm very passionate about, institutions especially, talking about more and training their leadership especially on more, because we all come into our engagements and our positions and so on with a huge amount of unconscious bias. And because it's so easily learnt, it's scary, and we should be scared of it. So yeah, we need to face it bravely and face it directly.
Zander, what would you say in your experience would be a source of unconscious bias?
Just the way that we perceive different gender groups, for example, is a great way to highlight our an understanding of unconscious bias. We think of like men typically. Men become doctors, engineers, pilots. Women, we associate like gender roles to them. Women become housewives, they become mothers. And so when we have a conversation, for example, and I say, oh, I'm going to the doctor, someone might say, oh, I hope he helps you feel better. That in itself, like immediately assuming the doctor is like a male, is a form of like unconscious bias that we encounter daily.
Definitely.
Thank you for that illustration. What would you say on a university, in the context of the university, in our daily lives, going to class, seeing our friends? What would you say would influence us?
Yeah, on the level of unconscious bias as a student that just exists on campus, there's the personal level of that. I think that comes down to something as simple as the kind of friend group that you form part of, right? Mm-hmm. Like the people you surround yourself with, your best friends, your close-knit circle, can often be hugely reflective of those unconscious biases, and that's an exercise I'm going to talk about later. And the racial dynamics of your friend group, the gender dynamics, sexuality dynamics, income and class dynamics of your friend group can often reflect what you have invited into your life because you like those things and covet those things, and what you don't like in terms of what you've excluded from your close circle of friends. So on a personal level, look at your friend groups, because more often than not, that'll tell you what your unconscious biases really are, which is quite scary. I think on like a institutional level with the university specifically, the most obvious example that jumps to mind is gender related as well, right? So I think just on the level of the university not recognizing the importance of offering gender neutral titles on things like student cards, on your official university documentations that are sent to you. I, as a non-binary person, have never been addressed as MX Guarandi on my student card, anything like that, which is very harmful. I've never been asked what I wanted from that. It was presumed and assigned to me. I'm addressed as he by lecturers because they assume that is just my gender identity. So even lecturers have no like conscious awareness that they should be taking those things into consideration, and that's largely just due to the fact that unconsciously they don't even know they should be aware of it, right? Which is not to say that there isn't work to be done and accountability to be had, but rather that there is a certain degree of lack of consent to the unconscious biases that make you a less better version of yourself, a more harmful version of yourself to the campus, to society, to students.
I also feel like some people put more effort into educating themselves and putting an effort into the way how they treat people than others. I think we see that on campus with certain lecturers being more open to calling people by their correct pronouns, actually asking you, like, listen, would you like me to call you by another pronoun? Because I feel like, especially in very big class groups, it just slips under the mat. We don't...
Yeah.
The university hasn't ever, that I know of, addressed that either. I know that this year we are given the option to change our pronouns on our emails and our student cards, which is progress in the right direction, but I agree with you that it's not up to standard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, do you have anything to add, Xander?
I also think when, like Giuseppe mentioned, institutional biases that might exist, I am so sorry. I'm low-key extremely nervous about this.
You're doing great.
But yeah, thank you. Now it's in the record, you guys. But the way our campus is designed, it is very much designed for someone who is able-bodied, who is able to easily maneuver around. You can get up, you can walk upstairs, you can quickly, the BA building, the halls in the BA building, extraordinarily narrow. So it immediately, the spaces that we occupy already start othering people, and it's like an unconscious bias of us to assume that everyone is able to traverse the same spaces as easily as we are allowed to. And that's a way that the spaces that we inhabit inform and reinforce our unconscious biases that we might have, that you are not necessarily aware of that you have, but yeah.
Definitely.
Earlier, when you spoke about our our friend groups influence the way we think, if you are in a position where you feel that one of your friends are being biased, or you feel that they might have some unconscious bias that they are not aware of, how do you approach that?
Right, right. So I'm going to talk about this a bit later, I think, in terms of how we can go about our lives to address unconscious biases, rectify them where we see them, and so on, just to become better at identifying them, really. But if I were to quickly touch on it now, I think the first thing is to have yourself equipped to recognize unconscious biases when they manifest outwardly as straight up biases, and especially within your friend groups. Firstly, just completely shedding the fear of calling your close friends out. You know, it's not a personal affront to tell your friend, I think you're being harmful in this way. I'd like you to be better at this for the sake of being a better person to other people around us. You know, I think shedding that fear of accountability really is the first step, because accountability, if it's done correctly, is never an attacking, harmful, degrading process. It's purely self-help really, and it's purely remedy. So being able to do that on a basal level with your friends is something you need to get equipped with. If they're your friends, if you're comfortable with them, there should absolutely be no fear in calling them out where you see it, right? And it should be a reciprocal thing as well.
Yes, I also agree in the sense of, if you can't have uncomfortable conversations with your friends, then why are you friends in the that's probably the wrong thing to say, but why are you friends in the first place? You should be on that level where you're able to discuss societal issues with your friends, because I don't know about you, but would you really want to be friends with someone who just does not care about the way that they treat people?
Yeah, exactly.
True, yeah.
It's just a sore point.
Yeah.
And on the point of people who say that they were raised in a certain way and that's the reason why they are biased, or they're more prone to have certain biases, why do you think that is? Do you think that's a valid excuse, or?
Sure. Do you want to address this? Or?
No, you can go first. It's okay.
Thank you, my love. I think, okay, so there's a whole lot of research behind this, and just a lot of anthropological and sociological work around how it is that we develop our opinions,
Yes.
right? And our worldviews, essentially. And of course, a huge part of that, it comes down to your environment. You are born into a certain set of circumstances by pure chance. So the type of parents you have, the type of views that those parents have. If
Sorry to interrupt you. So external factors that play a role.
No, absolutely, yeah. And it exists within the home and outside. It expands to the school you went to. It expands to the suburb or lack of suburb that you live in. What country you live in. All of these factors. It starts from the home and gradually works its way out in terms of all of the forces at play of how you form your opinions and your biases based on how you were raised, right? And I think the important thing with that is to just quite simply recognize the circumstances you were born into were not your choice. You were born into something by chance, a lottery of birth, as Rawls, as the philosophers would say, right? That choice you did not make. Your consent does not exist there. What you do have control over, what you do have consent over, is what you do with those circumstances, at the very least, internally, with your opinions, with your worldview. And it is, I personally just don't believe that environmental determinism and all of those things are legitimate enough excuses for going through your entire life, going through the world, with the opinions that your upbringing, how you were raised gave you. You absolutely, after a certain point, develop enough autonomy to say, if you can see when you're hurting someone, is what I'm saying. So if you were raised in a way that is harmful, if you were raised to be homophobic, queerphobic, racist, you can see that those opinions and worldviews manifest in hurt. And the point at which you're comfortable with hurting people is when you've lost your humanity. And that's the point at which you have autonomy. You can choose, how do I want to change what I was taught? How do I want to unlearn and relearn new things to be a less harmful person?
Okay, so now the question is, with unconscious bias, if you are unconscious of the fact that you have the bias, then how do you go about telling yourself or deciding that, okay, no, I need to make a change, or I need to start educating myself on these topics because my opinion is harmful, if you don't know that you have that opinion?
Right. So actually, that's actually a good segue. So could I run like a quick little thought experiment with you guys?
Cool.
Like a little... Okay, cool. So I'm gonna probe you or prompt you with a certain scenario-based thought experiment, and just tell me what immediately pops into your head. The very first sort of knee-jerk reaction that your brain puts forward from into your frontal thinking capacity section of your mind. So the scenario goes like this. A father is driving his son back from school when they suddenly get into an accident in which the father is tragically killed, but the child survives but is in a very, very critical state and being rushed to the hospital. The son has to go into surgery immediately, and while on the operating table, the surgeon walks in and looks at the patient and exclaims, "That's my son." What is the relation between the surgeon and the son? The first thing that jumps to your mind.
It's his father, the son's father. Like, I mean, yeah.
Sure. What was your knee-jerk reaction?
I'm very confused. I just, the first thing that popped into my head was that would be irrelevant in the setting, in a medical setting.
Right. Yeah.
That's just how I think. But yeah, can you please repeat it?
Sure. So the father dies in the car accident. The son survives but is critical, so gets rushed to the hospital. Has to go into surgery, and then while on the operating table, the surgeon that walks in to operate on the patient says, "Oh my gosh, that's my son." What's the relation between the surgeon and the son?
They're married. At least his son. He's married to the other father.
Yeah. What would be the first relation though that jumps to your mind? Is it the?
Oh, I understand what you're saying.
Right.
You would immediately assume that it is biological son.
Sure, but. So I think
I'm not getting this.
We're
No,
totally
it's so
derailing,
fine. It's so fine.
this thought exercise.
No. But the confusion is actually necessary, I think, because immediately when I first did this exercise, which was like in 2018, so I was like, oh my gosh, like first year of uni, I'm so woke, I'm like a cut above the rest at Stellenbosch University, and then someone prompted me with this exercise, and immediately the first thing that my brain did was to go, but I thought the father died, how can he be the surgeon? My brain immediately got confused because I just could not imagine his mother being the surgeon, for instance, his other father being the surgeon.
That is actually true. Sorry to interrupt you, but the first thing I immediately just assumed that the surgeon would be a man.
Yeah, literally. And I think that thought experiment, as simple as it is so nuanced in forcing your brain to recognize the unconscious bias that led you to be either immediately confused at first, which is how I experienced it, or to immediately just go, maybe it's another father, gay dads or queer fathers or whatever. But it's very hard, at least for my brain when I first did it, it was very hard for my brain to connect the dots that a woman could ever possibly be in this position. And in first year, I was a radical feminist, I still am. I thought I was, the poster child for the modern day feminism and so on. No, apparently not, because my unconscious bias just jumped out of me and I was like, what?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing.
Yeah.
A lot of us, we're so set in our ways, I'm not queerphobic, I'm not homophobic, I'm not a racist, but then we don't realize that we have these intrinsic opinions.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think what's especially important with that thought experiment, just to segue into some facts or whatever, I guess, is, so when I was doing research for this, what that shows us is that we only consciously process about, actually far less than 1% of the information that we are being bombarded with in our day-to-day lives. And far less than 1% is quite a scary thing. Sure, do you want to go?
Sorry, so
No, go
from
ahead.
a psychological point of view, would you say that's a learned behavior that everyone experiences? Or
The lack of
to
processing.
to make that connection immediately, this can't be, there's two fathers, the surgeon can't be a woman. Do you think that is because of learned behavior or okay?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's almost entirely learned, because I don't believe that anyone's born with their unconscious bias.
It's just interesting for me because it touches on the problem that our education system is designed for heterosexual people. We learn certain things in school, opposites, black, white, male, female, but we don't get the whole perspective. And I think when we get to university, it's very hard because some of us, like Xander and myself, we come from very small towns, and unfortunately,
extremely conservative.
exactly,
Right.
most small towns have that small-minded mindset, and then you get here and suddenly you're bombarded with images and new opinions and people who are simply different, and I think it freaks out a lot of us, and then we retract into our shell, no, I don't want to learn, I want to see what I'm used to, or if you're uncomfortable in a situation, you would rather remove yourself from that situation and not learn.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I mean, small town mentality is definitely a huge environmental factor that'll determine
And
how
I think
you move
we,
through it.
in high school, we spoke about this earlier. We got this really Christian education about a man should be with a woman. And that's so horrible. That also touches
Yeah.
on unconscious bias, actually, because what if you're a queer kid and you're sitting there like, so I just don't exist to you?
Literally, yeah. Yeah, and I think in the case of something like that, with what you guys experienced at school, that's actually just conscious bias that you're being
Yes.
fed, because it's not even like they're subliminally telling you it's okay to be queer, but also the norm should be this, you know. That's like very explicit biases being fed to you, and that's like, that comes with a whole range of detriments, definitely. I think what's interesting about unconscious bias, though, is that even if you went through your life in a super like liberal household, schooling system, very egalitarian principles and so on, even if you went through all of that, at the very least, you cannot guarantee that the rest of the world looks like that. And what happens when the media you're being fed, for instance, like the movies you watch, the cartoons we grew up watching, only showed heteronormative relationships? There's nothing wrong with them showing heteronormative relationships, but the point at which they were only showing that was the point at which a kid isn't born queerphobic, but if they've only ever been showed images of heteronormative relationships, that can at the very least manifest into biases that when they do see a queer relationship or queer partnership, their immediate unconscious bias reaction is to go, that's not normal, that's very foreign to me, that's very strange. And some people react to that, it's that shock and that sort of whiplash. Some people react to that fine, and they're like, oh, I never thought about it, how interesting, I'm going to try to bear that in mind next time. Other people react to it more violently. Some people say, no, this is absolutely not what my brain has ever been programmed and wired to recognize. It is so aggressively foreign to me that I don't know how to navigate this thing. And those issues can become incredibly nuanced, because it can look as simple as the white friend who's an ally to POCs being like, oh my god, work girl, your hair looks so good, can I touch it? She might not be thinking she's doing anything wrong by asking, can I touch your hair because I love it so much? But to a POC girl, she absolutely will take that as, why is this white girl trying to touch my hair? Like, it's not a petting zoo, you know?
Yeah.
So even the most presumed liberal or presumed quote-unquote woke, I don't like using that term, it's a bit buzzwordy and like, I don't know, weirdly overdone, but even the most woke person can have the best of intentions, and intentions mean nothing if you've hurt someone at the end of the day. And I've certainly experienced that as a queer person, as a biracial person, allies who are good people, I think, at the end of the day, but who do hurt me unintentionally, and that's purely because of unconscious biases. People who know my pronouns, very good friends of mine who know my pronouns, because their conditioning and their wiring on the unconscious level was to think of gender in the binary, they will still, mess up my pronouns, right? And that's because it just needs to be rewired. It just needs to, all that work that went into conditioning you to be the person that you are now on the unconscious level, you need to clear that stuff out and rewire the unconscious brain.
I also think it's important to constantly just check in on yourself. I feel like all of us, we don't like to admit it, but it's the truth. We think wrong thoughts sometimes. Like, you will have a bad encounter with someone and your mind will immediately go to that negative stereotype. And I feel like when that happens, we have to constantly check ourselves, like, no, you are the wrong person in this situation, or even this is why you're thinking in this way, and that's what you should do to adjust your thinking. And while we're on that, could you maybe give us a few tips on how you could learn to recognize your own bias and what you can do to address that?
Sure. So I think the first thing for me is, if I were to make like recommendations, is to recognize that a lot of people do have ways to circumvent their unconscious biases, right? Based on like just factors that they were born into. So for instance, if I was born to a black father who is a policeman, right, and a good policeman, it would be very weird for me to then constantly see in movies, television shows, on the news, black people portrayed as criminals, with no like nuanced interrogation of why crime rates are so high in densely populated POC areas, for instance. With no interrogation of the nuances of that, I could be consuming that media, and where a white person would passively be like slowly learning in their unconscious brain, POCs are criminals, POCs gravitate towards criminality, stuff like that. Where they would be learning that, I would just go home to my black policeman father who's very good at his job and be like, well, there's a black person who's absolutely the antithesis and the opposite of what the media has been feeding me. And I'd be lucky enough to have that experience because I wouldn't have to unlearn those things because I never learned them, because I had a way to avoid learning those things. In the event that you don't have the ability to avoid certain learning certain things, I think maybe like 3 primary recommendations I'd recommend for fixing that. The first for me is to, and this is going to sound crazy, but it actually works, is to literally just like spend a week consciously noticing everything around you. So that stat earlier about like how your brain can only really process less than 1% of the information being given to you, that information is like 11 million bits of information per second, something crazy like that, and you would only process 50 bits of it. Force your brain for just a week to notice everything around you. Notice what the person you're talking to is wearing. Notice the color of the walls of the room you're in. Force your brain to stop being lazy to the small things around it that it would normally just let the unconscious brain process instead of the conscious brain. And if you do that for a week, you'd be surprised how much your conscious brain becomes almost fit in a way to make it sporty or something.
Yes, it's a muscle, so...
Literally a muscle. So train that muscle. Make it fit again to be conscious to the things that are around it as much as possible. And no, I'm not saying that after you've done this for a week you should notice everything around you, like the color of everything, the clothes everyone is wearing. But at the very least, your brain's going to be able to recognize certain things that it wouldn't have. And you need to then take the second step, which is to make sure you gear your conscious brain that is now fit towards the things that matter. And I think the things that matter are quite simply identity groups, experiences, to make sure that you are as safe for people outside of your identity bracket and your experience group to be around without feeling like you could ever hurt them, especially in microaggressions, because that's especially where unconscious bias will manifest. I don't think someone who is like generically liberal and believes in the values of equality and social justice would be outwardly problematic, but they can definitely be on a micro level problematic, and those can hurt just as much.
Yes, I think that's something important you just said now that a lot of us believe that we are extremely liberal, but we don't actually address our behavior. So we don't examine our own behaviors. We're quick to point fingers at other people, but we are very hesitant to educate ourselves further on matters that we think we know a lot about.
That's so true. And I just feel like lived experiences and the plethora and diversity and multitude of lived experiences that you are not always going to be exposed to.
Yes.
Like if you consider what media we're being fed, because that's especially where we develop our unconscious biases outside of the home, consider what media we're being fed. We grew up without really ever seeing queer relationships on TV. But if you interrogate what that media looks like that we grew up with, it's bigoted. It's inherently bigoted media, right? At best, it doesn't show a range of lived experiences. At worst, it does show those lived experiences, but in a very, very negative and untruthful light. Or at worst, it shows those experiences as demonized, like actively demonized. And it's often the latter that we got exposed to. And that's what especially has fueled our unconscious bias as a generation, I feel, is that ignorance to not being exposed to those lived experiences, and it elevates above ignorance to the point of active bigotry when it's shown as demonized, as something bad, evil, and taboo almost, right? Do you want to go ahead, though?
That's what I wanted to talk about. There's been a lot of awareness recently around representation in media, especially the lack of diversity that we see in the shows that we watch and in the media that we consume. There's even a lack of diversity behind who is writing the stories that we're reading, who is making the decisions that are impacting our lives.
No, exactly. We don't even get to see that.
But then we also need to look at the type of representation that we're seeing, because it doesn't help that we make Hollywood more inclusive, or we make the shows that we watch more inclusive, but then we cast people of color as the villains. Or if we tell the story of a person of color, we tell it like, I take The Blind Side, for example. It's
a white savior situation.
Terrible movie.
But it's inherent, like at its core, it's a story about a black man overcoming literally all of the odds. Like everything is stacked against him, and he comes to this point where he is a top athlete. He is the cream of the crop. He's at a place where so many people work so hard to get to.
Yeah.
And then we tell his story, but we tell it through the like lens of
Anglo-Saxon
a
lens,
white, of a white woman.
Yeah.
So it doesn't help that we introduce like more representation, but the type of representation that we get continues to like facilitate harmful stereotypes and stuff. And it's like you mentioned, you're not actively taking it in. Like, you're not watching the film thinking, oh, this white woman is like obviously the reason this man's successful. You're thinking, okay, no, he's really a good athlete.
Yeah.
But then unconsciously what you take away from this is that he needed like a white person to come in and to help him.
Yeah.
When that's not
Yes,
really the
exactly.
reality.
We tend to see that movie through the lens of, oh, this white lady is so wonderful. She helped this man get his life back. But at the end of the day, it was his talent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fully.
That, yeah.
And I think it's, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's also, it speaks to like, there are so many people like in life who are able to achieve so many great things, but then you look at how like discrimination and the exclusion of like people of color from economic activity and stuff affects, like, it has a generational effect.
Yeah.
So if he had been born, if like Michael Orr had been born to a family that would be able to foster his talents, to tell him, okay, no, we'll send you to the best football high school we can, then he would have reached the NFL on his own. But because we have like these societal like these structures of inequality within our society that prevents people from like achieving the things that they're good in, or achieving their dreams and things, we often have like this unconscious bias of saying, okay, no, but like, you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Life's hard for everyone. You just have to work. But it's important to remember that, like, even if you do put in all the work and you do like,
You know, the system's game against you.
at the end of the day, it's important to also recognize that the structures that we inhabit, large scale structures, also like facilitate an unconscious bias, and are also biased themselves like towards the people that inhabit them.
Yeah, I actually want to use that as like a segue into certain media that I think is good, actually, for sort of like reprogramming your brain and actively combating the unconscious biases that we have actually been fed in media. So the counter consumption principle is what I would call it. But before that, what you were describing is so important, because it really does, like, unconscious bias isn't just this passive small thing where you're only committing microaggressions.
Yeah.
It'll often manifest as microaggressions, which are terrible and just as dehumanizing, but it can often go above that. Case in point, police, right? Like, the willingness for an officer to put their hand on their trigger when they're pulling over a black driver for like speeding or something, is a very harmful manifestation of unconscious bias, where they might, and I really do believe this is true from what I've read statistically, they might not do that for pulling over a white driver, for instance. They will handle people more violently and more roughly if they're people of color. All of those things don't come from nowhere, because police academies didn't teach them black people are criminals, POCs are criminals, but what they did teach them is, in some shape, way or form, in the police academy, outside of these academies, just society, media in general, is to be wary of POCs. And that's an unconscious programming that often, more than not, won't have been told to them explicitly, but they've learnt it anyway. And that's when unconscious bias hits its peak of harm. But getting on to like good media, so there's a lot of bad media out there, right? Like
A lot.
Like the blind side, right? That's
Yeah,
Sandra Bullock. She was great in it, whatever. I loved her in it, but
It was a
anyway,
good movie, but the
yeah,
other
and
message
she's
was
just a
better.
great actress. Yeah, that's a good example of really just poor messaging going on in a movie, especially from a racial perspective. I think The Help is up there with some of the worst
Definitely, The Help is up
messaging
there.
in media from a racial perspective, because the
And that's
unconscious bias
such like
is there.
Viola Davis. It's
No,
just
fully.
an iconic actress, and then
Yeah, no, that is sad. But I do think there's really good stuff out there, right? And it needs to be a range of media that you consume, because if we've been consuming bad media, which I think we can all admit, at the very least in our generation, we can admit there's been a lot of terrible media we've consumed. We need to counter-consume, is what I call it. So if you're consuming one thing that we find as being harmful for our unconscious brains, consumes the opposite of that, something that we can actively trust is good and will reprogram our minds passively. And I think good examples of that, like, are RuPaul's Drag Race, firstly. Fantastic show that exposes people to drag culture, to certain subgroups within the queer community. I mean, in the current season of US Drag Race, there's the first ever trans man competing on RuPaul's Drag Race, which has been groundbreaking. We see his top surgery scars, which is something a lot of people just have never known is a thing, right? So a lot of wealth can come from something like RuPaul's Drag Race, for a diverse exposure to a diverse set of lived experiences within the queer community. I think We're Here is a really great show as well, on HBO. It's these 3 drag queens who go into small town America and help queer people who are stuck in homophobic and queerphobic settings to, like, love themselves, better their circumstances, stuff like that. It's fantastic. A great show that I just started watching is Veneno, which is about a trans Spanish icon in the 90s and her life story. And I think I'm especially passionate about gender experiences from a queer lens, and especially transgender experiences, because that is absolutely not something we were exposed to growing up. Yeah. And when we were exposed to it, it was, oh, man in a dress trying to be a woman, haha, it's
exactly.
so funny.
Think about, sorry to interrupt you, but think about movies like The Silence of the Lambs. That
exactly
was extremely hurtful and just inaccurate at best. There was something else. Oh, have you watched Big Mouth?
Oh, absolutely.
On Netflix. I feel like that's also a good place to start.
Yes, I really do love that show. Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's very informative.
Very, very much. So even when you're an adult, it's really valuable. Yeah. Veneno, great show about trans women and their experiences. And so much that even I did not know. Like, I fall within the trans umbrella as a non-binary person, but I still had so little exposure to the trans experience, right? Especially for trans women of color. Fantastic show there. Are You the One has a season, I think season 8 of Are You the One. They only cast, it's the queer season, quote unquote. But they only cast queer people for that season of Are You the One? So non-binary people, pansexual people. So everyone was queer, which I think is really cool on reality TV. Especially, I think we grew up watching things like Geordie Shore and like what are the other ones? Love Island and so on. It's so heteronormative.
I think it's just great to see like a representation of yourself on screen.
Absolutely.
That means something to someone
but
somewhere.
Also, like, I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No.
Queer representation can sometimes be extraordinarily problematic, especially when it is implied that, like, queer baiting, implied that a character might be queer or something.
Yeah.
To have queer people watch the show. Like, that's, so,
oh, yes, and then when they get into a relationship, it lasts 2 episodes and they get killed off.
Fill your gaze.
Such a common trope, within the media. Yeah, so even in our modern day, while there are great shows out there, and more often than not, just ask people within those demographics, hey, like, what are you watching now? I mean, I would hope you have queer friends by now, like, it's, everyone's queer. I would hope you have a diverse range of friends that you can rely on and have these chats with and be like, hey, what are you watching right now? What would you recommend right now? It's as easy as striking up a conversation of like, what are you listening to right now, and work from there to ensure that you're getting good quality counter consumption, because there is certainly bad media that we could consume and be like, oh, I'm fixing my unconscious bias, when really you're just replacing it with something else that is still problematic. So be very wary of the media you consume. That's the bottom line, I think, to this.
I don't know. I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No, don't apologize.
With like in the wake of George Floyd's murder, one of like Netflix saw a huge surge in people who went to watch The Help and things like The Blind Side. That's specifically why I mentioned like The Blind Side and stuff. So it's ties back into what you're saying. It's to be mindful of the media and the product that we are consuming, and to be mindful of how the product itself is also shaped by, in some cases, like I think of The Blind Side was very much a deliberate choice to reframe the film, but like the people who have made the movie and the people involved in it, they themselves also carry a lot of unconscious biases with them, and that influences the I'm tapping on the table. That influences the product, the final product that we see as consumers. So it's also really important to keep in mind that like how you said, that what we are consuming itself can be riddled with a bunch of unconscious biases that we have to be
You touched on something so important there, because like even if for some reason your friend group is just like straight cisgendered white people, you can at least know who's making the media you're consuming, because you look at it the credits for a film, for instance, and you can find out who made the movie. Does it have a POC director? Are there POCs in the writing room? Are there queer people in the writing room? Is it a woman directing this film? You can find out who was part of the production process of the media you consume. That's not hard. That's just, in fact, responsible consumption, I think. And you should do that, absolutely. And Veneno, for instance, is a great example of a show where it's about trans experiences, where the trans people in the show were all trans women actresses, and where production companies would normally be like, no, but there aren't enough trans actors. These the people who went into making this show actively said, no, we are deliberately going to cast and find trans women who are actors and make sure they are the ones involved in the portrayal of this specific experience, so that we do not butcher what we're communicating in terms of that experience, that it's truthful. And that's how you ensure great media. So yeah, I agree with you. Find out who's in the room that's making it.
Like Dallas Buyers Club, like Jared Leto was wonderful in that, but I felt like that was a very bad casting choice, because there are so many trans people in the acting industry who are suffering to work because of bias, and are you just hiring a straight white man? Fully.
And I think the unconscious messaging that was going on with that performance is so important as well, right? Like, this cisgendered man was portraying a trans experience, a gender non-conforming experience, as a cisgendered man. And in the production of that, for instance, he wasn't being like fed any like information or like tips or so on about that. He was just given this role and allowed to work with it how he saw fit. And I mean, the role speaks for itself now when we watch it in retrospect.
Didn't he even win an Oscar for it?
He won an Oscar
very
for
wild
that
if you
performance.
think about it.
Like a method actor though, so he probably had some justification. The
performance speaks for itself.
I'm not defending.
But I don't think
that's not what's happening here.
Yeah, no, I mean,
fully agree with
it was fully the trans queer person who is morally pure and doesn't do anything wrong, so when they die in the end, because they inevitably have to die in the end, they're just this angel going to heaven, and they're not complex, they're not nuanced as people. They're just, we're expected as queer trans people to be the best, most morally like upstanding people, otherwise we're not worth anything in terms of representation. So yeah, I think that's a great example of where it was dangerously done. Yeah, definitely. Music, the new movie by Sia.
So
we don't.
It is terrible.
Just if you're just like a PSA, if you want to, like, I'm looking directly into the camera right now. If you want resources on like autism, and you want to see like how autism manifests, and you want to see like representation, Sia's movie is not it.
Yeah, if you have autism, please don't watch that movie. The strobe lights are going to give you
firstly, it
problems.
was not made for atypical or neurotypical rather people.
Which is just lazy. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you think about the fact that it was supposed to be a movie specifically made for people with autism. Like, I think it's even... Sorry, again.
No,
I think it's even... Like, we're all excited to see representation on screen, but I think it's so much worse when you see that representation, but it's not an accurate representation.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's extremely unhelpful, too, because now you kind of convey that wrong depiction, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. And I mean, at least what we have now is... the ability for us to have the conversations about something like Music by Sia, where autistic people and neurotypical people are saying, we really don't approve of this. This is really terrible and such a butchered misrepresentation of our experiences. And people take that seriously. We can give a platform for those conversations to happen, and we can deplatform the movie or Sia if she's problematic, or anyone for that matter who's problematic. And we can rectify that more now than we could back then. Because back then, to bring it back to like a Silence of the Lambs example, the trans community said stuff about that. Like, we were upset about Silence of the Lambs. It was like very controversial. No one cared. It still won Best Picture, and it is a great movie, I have to admit. But no one cared about those conversations, right? Like, trans people didn't have a platform to like spur on critical engagement in terms of the media we're consuming. So at the very least, we have that now, right? Like, there are more people taking queer people seriously, POC seriously, women seriously, when we say, this is misrepresentation, do not consume this thinking that you now have knowledge about my experience, because you don't. And then we can rectify that. And if we can just magnify that.
Yes,
it'll
it's
be
wonderful
brilliant.
that we have I think the internet provided us with a much larger platform to
Fully.
voice our concerns,
Fully.
which the previous generation did not have.
I mean, before I came out, YouTube's the reason that it's partly the reason that I had the courage to do that, right? Like, watching queer YouTubers where I had never seen any queer people in any form of media before, being able to watch queer YouTubers without fear of, like, anyone catching you or anything. And, there was that huge thing of, like, queer YouTubers coming out and making coming out videos. That was huge for me for my process of coming out, right? Like, to see people do that in the media.
Just to see other people.
You weren't seeing queer characters coming out on, like, your favorite cartoon or anything.
There weren't queer characters to begin with.
Literally, and now we have, like, Steven Universe, for instance. So the progress is so there. Yeah. Just move a bit closer.
Move a bit closer?
Yeah.
Oh. Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the second step in terms of my recommendations. Counter consumption. Like, go for the opposite thing that you're used to consuming. Verify that it's actually good and won't further harm you. Look into who made it, who produced it, who watches it, because oftentimes the people watching it can also be an indicator of what the quality of it is like.
That's actually true.
And then consume it, and then keep consuming stuff like that, and keep forcing your brain to unlearn and relearn new things, and your unconscious mind will become healthier for it. I think the last step then of my recommendations is just to correct. So correct yourself, and this links to what you asked me earlier. Correct yourself, correct your friends, and make sure that you are reciprocally broadening your worldviews, right?
No, I think it's also important to just accept the fact that we are all going to have unconscious biases, and we need to work on it. Like, you can't just one day wake up and be like, okay, I'm a new person, I don't have any more. It's a constant thing that you constantly have to check yourself.
So many things.
Me too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the correction process, very explicit correction process, is essential to that. It is not an affront to you if someone calls you out. Yes. They're trying to make sure that you don't do it again.
I think that's the other thing. Like, we tend to take things personally, but
Yeah.
for that person, it's not like, oh, you're just acting in a bad way. It's like an active, hurtful situation.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Exactly. And it's serious. I think a good example for me in terms of the correcting people is a big thing that we just don't talk about enough is in terms, and this is an unconscious bias, is how we use very ableist terminology in our day-to-day lives. Like, trigger warning, I'm just going to say the terms for these identity groups and how we butcher them. The term dumb, for instance, or deaf or blind, those are real people who are dumb, or I guess we'd say mute now. Those are real people in the blind community, in the deaf community. Those are real identity groups. So when we just throw that around in our day-to-day conversation, because unconsciously we've learned it's okay to say, in place of saying someone is like being stupid or something, we say the D word. That's not okay, but it is so unconsciously ingrained in us that we've never been called out on it. And when I really do try to call people out on it, but it's so normalized. I really wanted to mention the ableist, like, language that we use, because I think it's a perfect example of unconscious bias that is aggressive. It's not like microaggressive, it's just straight up aggressive. Because in the same way you wouldn't, at least I hope you wouldn't, describe something as, oh, that's so gay, because that's obviously offensive. Yeah. Like, you don't, like, what? You don't use a whole identity group to describe something as bad, you know? Yeah. That's the same principle. You wouldn't describe someone as the D word to call them stupid, because that's a whole category of people that have nothing to do with it. But historically, that's where the term came from, you know, etymology. That's where we made those links. And it hurts people. So call people out. I call people out for ableist language all the time. And you should too, like, and anything, not just ableism. So yeah, just constantly correct yourselves, the people around you, and yourself. Yeah. There was a little exercise actually that I wanted to mention with regards to this. I think relating to the friend group stuff that I mentioned earlier, because your friend group can become very important in terms of reflecting your unconscious biases. Like, if you're at home, literally just take a piece of paper and make a list of your close circle of friends, like 5 of your closest friends, whatever. Like, from top to bottom, vertically, that's vertical?
Yeah. A column.
A vertical column. And then on a horizontal column above that, make headings for different identity categories. So race, gender, education level, so like primary, tertiary, whatever education level they have or that they're at, religious affiliations, stuff like that. Make identity brackets as categories horizontally, and then fill in where your friends fit into that. And at the end of it, tally it up at the bottom of those columns, tally it up at the end, and if all of your friends are white, if all of your friends are cisgendered, if all of your friends are heterosexual, if all of your friends are like Christian or something, if all of your friends are one thing, and that one thing is what you are as well, so do a category for yourself at the bottom as well. If all your friends look like you, move through the world like you, experience life like you, have the same worldview as you, I'm just going to say it, there's something wrong with that. Mm-hmm. Like, there is no excuse in this day and age for the people that you surround yourself, because you choose who you surround yourself with. There is no excuse for you not to try and broaden that to some degree. But don't tokenize people. That's the one thing to be aware of.
You shouldn't... Sorry?
No, please continue.
You shouldn't go out in life and say, oh, I have a black friend and I have a gay friend and I have a transgender friend, so now I need another XYZ friend. Like, that should not also be the way that you approach this at
Absolutely not. I think with the exercise that I just described, what you should take from it, so do not take that, oh, I need to start tokenizing people and gather queer friends like Pokemons and like women friends and blah, blah, blah.
It's just the thing about be more aware of who you surround yourself with.
Do self-reflection with the exercise. So I'm not saying go outside and fix it. You look internally and say, how did I get here? How are all my friends exactly like me?
Yes, that's actually a great way to find out, like, if you might have some unconscious bias too.
Exactly. So
you could just follow. Exactly. You should actually write that down for me, and I can put it on the Instagram post.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely, I'll share
also,
it.
the movies and shows that we
watch.
I'll
send a recommendation list, definitely. Okay.
Yeah. Something that we further wanted to speak about was religion in schools.
Mm-hmm.
The way that people, me, for example, I went to an Afrikaans public school, and on Monday mornings you had to sit in the hall, you had to listen to the whole Christian sermon. If you belonged to any other faith, you had to go and stand outside in the cold in winter sometimes. Yeah, it's horrible. Yeah. And you didn't have the choice whether you wanted to stay and actually listen to that sermon and go stand outside with the other people. You were just forced, because the school system automatically assumes that we are all Christians. And if you don't belong to that specific religion, then you're just excluded from everything, because now you miss that whole assembly.
Right. Sorry, I'm just caught in the shock of that being a thing. Was there a question there? Sorry, I'm just so shocked.
Yeah, we just kind of want to elaborate if you want to say a few things out of your experience.
I think, sure. Do you want to take this?
It's...
Okay, sure. That's terrible. That should absolutely be abolished, like banned, just stop being a thing. I think just on a purely principled level, school is so fundamental on an unconscious level of programming you. Because you don't go into high school a fully formed person. You have all of these ideas simmering in the back.
Even in matric, you have no idea of who you are.
Even in uni. Like, you're constantly... humans are organic beings. You're constantly changing.
Your personality is constantly evolving. We're never from a psychological perspective.
But we definitely go into new spaces, new institutions, new levels of education. We definitely go into it with certain ideas. We go into it with things simmering in our unconscious brains. The question then is, how does that institution or space then shape it and either progress it or further rot it, essentially, and make it worse. And I think in the case of something like hyper-religious, like high schools in South Africa, which is very common, as we know, I don't know why I was shocked, it just was crazy to hear. But in the case of something like that, schools absolutely have no right to be programming any certain way of living.
I think that's illegal in terms of the Schools Act as well, but as we know, people don't care. If a school makes a decision to send you out, they will do it. They really don't care about regulations, because they're so steadfast in their beliefs. Like, you have to...
Yeah, and even if schools policies change, if the teachers don't enact them in their day-to-day professional lives,
and that's the problem, because they feel like because they believe that that's the right way to do it, they just disregard everyone else.
I think that's a really good example of how an explicit bias informs an implicit one. So explicitly,
that's kind of what I want to get to. Sorry.
You go through high school and your experience is that people who are not Christian don't get included into certain activities, and so that forms an unconscious bias where you feel it might be acceptable to later in life say, oh no, but this, like, oh, only the Christian friends are getting together, so sorry. That's
do you want to come to church with me?
Like,
that's the first joke.
Assuming everyone's Christian or something. That starts to form implicit biases.
Like, there's nothing wrong with being Christian. It's just I feel like some people just like Bible thumping others.
Yeah, I mean, I was raised Catholic, for instance, and that came with all of the bells and whistles of being Catholic. You know, like, being queer in the Catholic Church is very hard. All of those difficulties came with it. I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with Catholicism at the end of the day. I'm an atheist now, but like, I could see myself being anything on a purely like ideological level if it agrees with my worldview and principles. Yes. The point at which any institution, religious or otherwise, Islam, Christianity, feminism, or whatever the opposite of that would be, I guess straight up patriarchy, whatever institution we're talking about, the point at which that it is an indoctrination of actively externally harmful things, i.e. the point at which Christian teachings can become queerphobic, can become sexist, or just, even if they're not those things, become monolithic and force everyone into the religious mold of Christianity, which seems like what your school was trying to do. That's just straight up harmful. And then there is no basis on which the ideology is worthwhile enough to maintain, to preserve, because of the amount of external harm that's coming from it. And like you said, that external harm in this case is explicit. Like, there are clearly kids being excluded, there are clearly indoctrinations taking place, but it absolutely, in the long term, will affect their unconscious brains.
Leads to, exactly. You get to university, you just hang out with your group of Christian friends that you made from high school. Now you see someone from a different religion, you're like, okay, no, I'm not going to mix with them. You know, you get this kind of sense that other religions are bad and their practices are wrong because Christianity is the only right religion. And unconsciously, you kind of push those people away.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that really needs to be addressed in our school system.
And that's where the exercise becomes useful.
Yes.
If everyone around you looks like you, ask yourself how you pushed away people that don't look like
that.
I
feel like the whole education system just overlooks queer people. In South Africa, anyway.
We could have a whole other podcast about that.
I think, especially for newcomers coming to university this year and stuff, to be like, schools also act as a way to like solidify. Move closer. Schools also act as a way to like solidify income groups in certain cases. Like if you go to St. Andrews or something, it's really expensive, and the majority of students there will come from like affluent backgrounds and stuff. And so it's important to also be aware of how schools condition you to think about like the economic circumstances that people come from and the different economic backgrounds that people come from. To be also just be aware, like if you are a first year student coming out, we mentioned this earlier, that not everybody can just phone home and be like,
send me money. Not everyone has
that privilege and stuff. Exactly. And that's another way that like I think schools really schools so problematic.
Yes, we aren't aware
unconscious bias
of each other's socioeconomical circumstances.
Yeah.
That's also hard because we don't want to ask each other these type of questions. It's uncomfortable. People don't want to talk about being poor.
That's true.
Not necessarily being poor, but not being able to contribute. Say you go out for dinner with your friends and everyone orders expensive meals, but you don't feel comfortable to tell them like, hey, I'm a little short this week, I can't go with, and then you get excluded. Except you could have just gone to somewhere cheaper or more affordable.
Yeah. There's unconscious bias in that, and then there's the composite, which is also filled with unconscious biases, which is like me in first year being biracial, and I know it's because I'm biracial. A bunch of leadership people would just like ask me sometimes like, oh, I'm assuming you need like financial aid with this and this thing, so just come talk to me about that. And I'd be like, no, I don't. I'm actually fine for this one. I'm good. Why did you assume I needed that? And then it becomes this weird gaslighting thing. And this is the other ugly end of unconscious biases. You gaslight the people that you expose your unconscious bias to, because then they have to go home and be like, am I too dark? Is that why they made this assumption about me? Am I too feminized? Is that why they assumed this thing about me? It gaslights them into thinking they've done something to to earn the microaggression that your unconscious bias put out there. And then you're not even going to know that you put someone in an emotional tailspin because you thought you had good intentions. You thought you were asking the POC kid if they need financial assistance, who doesn't want to be that good white person that's asking those questions. You think you're being the good straight ally to the queer community that's saying, oh, you're gay, right? You're safe with me. Like, we can talk about gay stuff, blah, blah, blah. When in fact, that person might just be like pan or
just
gender non-conforming but straight. Like, who
treat
knows?
me like a person, please.
Or just
Exactly.
straight, and you can even be like straight and cisgendered and stuff, and you can still have like your tendencies. I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly,
It's okay.
but like your personality type and the way that you act and stuff is more feminized, effeminate,
Effeminate.
and then
Yeah.
effeminate, and then it's also like it's harmful to just assume, because then you are essentially invalidating someone's entire identity
Yeah.
with like one sentence. You're just
Fully.
fully leveling them.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Going back to that school level, we all know that one kid who had been bullied in primary school or high school for being gay, and
Yeah.
then they developed this whole complex against gay people, and like Xander said, it's just like a personality trait and people just assume. And I think that's also very harmful, and we don't speak about it enough. Like, if people get teased in school, teachers will just be like, oh, it's nothing, you know, you just move on, but
Yeah,
that
yeah.
becomes like a festering thing.
Yeah. I think the perfect example of what we've spoken about now, to bring it back to media consumption, is the show Friends. Like, people, like, Friends is especially popular amongst people our age and older than us and even younger than us. Friends is just such a hyper popular show, and I know anyone who likes Friends might come for me for this, whatever.
the friends
We just
not
have
common.
not, we just have not spoken enough about how Friends is wildly problematic, and it's often because the people who like Friends are cisgendered straight people. Like, I've spoken to queer people about it, and they're like, no, I never liked that show because it was extremely queerphobic. But cis straight people, often white but not always, love the show
Chandler's
Friends.
father.
Love the show Friends because they've never noticed that we treated Chandler's dad, for instance, who's a trans woman, firstly as a gender deviant, and secondly as just a drag queen, which is such a harmful miscorrelation thing
Yes,
happening
that
there.
character was in Friends just for comedic relief, and that's
Fully.
fucking disgusting. I'm so
Fully.
sorry.
Well, yeah, we'll bleep it out probably. But I mean that set back progress for trans and gender non-conforming people years, decades even, I firmly believe, because of how wildly popular that show
It still is
right?
today.
Like,
Yeah,
I still get questions, sorry, but like I still get questions like, oh, so are you like that trans guy from Silence of the Lambs when I wear a dress? Or are you like Chandler's dad? I've literally been asked things like that about my gender performance and gender identity. And it's like, what? If that's your media reference point and where your unconscious bias is referencing, that's gonna hurt me forever and people like me forever, you know? So I just thought that's an important
If I
example.
could ask you, if someone has a question about your sexuality or your pronouns, how would we approach that? Because I know that it's kind of... I mean, I don't want to go up to someone and just be like, okay, so hey, what are your pronouns? How do you find that out if you don't really know the person, but you also want to be respectful?
Can I go for this
Yeah,
one?
no.
Thank you. I think what's so easy about this is to quite simply take the lead. So when it comes to something like gender inclusivity, to quite simply when you meet someone, and I make a habit of this as much as possible, when I meet someone to say, hey, I'm Giuseppe, pronouns are they, them. I just take the initiative for it. Because then they know either that they can be comfortable saying their pronouns, or that maybe they didn't think they should have said their pronouns, or that's never crossed their mind, and now you've just told someone, you know, subconsciously, oh, remember that actually might be something you should ask in the future. Just take the lead with stuff like that. So state your own pronouns if you're comfortable with that. You don't have to, like, I understand that it's more sensitive for certain people, but if you're comfortable doing that, start a first meeting by saying your name and your pronouns, straight up. Don't ask people for it because they might not be comfortable, but at least start with yours.
Yeah.
If you find that it's necessary to slip your identity bracket into a conversation, you get to take the lead on that. No one gets to ask you to expose or confirm your gender identity to them because you might not be comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But at the very least, give people the space to take the lead for sharing their identity with you. And if you're just a safe person to be around that is combating their unconscious biases daily, that is constantly trying to be better, people will feel safe around you, especially people who aren't like you, who don't think and look and feel the way you do, will feel safe around you because you've made yourself the most harmless version of yourself possible. And that's the point at which I, as a non-binary person, might be comfortable with, like, confessing, or not confessing, but confiding in you if I wasn't out. I'm non-binary, by the way, and I feel safe telling you
Now that you've mentioned that, I just realized that you actually don't owe me anything. Like, you don't have to tell me.
Especially in terms of identity.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Identity is the most personal experience ever. So you let people take the lead with their own identities, and they'll come to you with it if they're comfortable with it. And if they haven't come to you with that stuff yet, that's fine. Then just minimize the amount of assumptions you make, minimize the amount of presumptions you make, and stuff like that, and you'll be fine, I think. Yeah.
Would you like to say something, Xander?
No, I'm good. I think Giuseppe summed it up really well.
Thank you. That was very informative.
Yeah,
sure.
It's quite uncomfortable asking people questions about their ethnicity and their sexuality, and because I feel like most of us, we want to get to know other people, because through education, that's the only way that we can learn more about each other and be more tolerant. But it's always uncomfortable to straight up ask people, like, okay, hey, what's your deal, you know?
Completely. It's like a final thing for me to say that links to what you've just said now. At the end of the day, like, that sounds like someone with good intentions, right? Someone who wants to, like, know what other people's deal is, what their lived experiences are like. That sounds like a good person, right? And it probably is a good person. At the end of the day, I think the bottom line to take away from my contribution to this is your intentions mean nothing. Have good intentions all you want, but the point at which those intentions don't translate into positive outcomes and external engagements, that's the point at which your intentions don't matter anymore. Because to the person you've now hurt with your good intentions, they don't care what you intended to say. It's what you did end up saying. It's how it communicated to them.
Okay, yeah, see, we really have to look at how we phrase things then.
Fully. And that's where, at the end of the day, unconscious bias is the starting point for fixing how your intentions manifest. Because good intentions are easy to acquire. You just have to not be a terrible person, really. It's how you communicate and translate your good intentions into your navigation of the world. And unconscious bias, all your biases are going to determine how you go about that navigation. So if you tackle your unconscious biases, you really weed out the terrible things about it and do the exercises and normalize that in your life, more often than not, your good intentions will translate as good. Yeah,
I think you just have to take that step, you know. You have to tell yourself, like, listen, I need to broaden my horizons, or I have this bias, I need to work on it.
Yeah.
Like we said earlier, we can't just assume that, okay, no, we're not problematic, even if you think that you aren't problematic.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Further, going back to the school situation, and unconscious, I don't know if it's an unconscious bias, because it definitely manifests physically, but I've noticed and this isn't only public high schools, it's schools everywhere, that black girls especially get discriminated against a lot for their hairstyles, and when they wear braids, it gets labeled unneat and messy, and when a white girl wears the same hairstyle and her hair falls out and it becomes loose and messy, then they just get a get out of jail free card. And that's something that I feel that we have to pay attention to in our education system, because so many of those girls, they get sent home, like, go home, go fix your hair, go cut your hair, you can't come into the school if you look like this. They miss education time, they miss out on class, they miss out on learning, and that is extremely unfair, and I feel like that's definitely something that we should speak about more.
Yeah, I agree. Do you want to comment on this one?
I'm white and I'm a male.
Yeah.
So, I'm male presenting, but this mic thing, you guys, I keep forgetting. Like I said, I'm white and I'm male presenting and stuff. So, I obviously have not lived the experience of, like, feeling that someone is judging me for, or like thinking, oh, like my hair's unkept, or it's unneat, or it's unprofessional, something. I have personally not lived that, but I think it's extraordinarily harmful that just, like, based on your appearance already, people have categorized you, have judged your level of professionalism.
Yes, actually, sorry to interrupt you, but that's true. It also happens in the work environment. If you apply to a job as a person of color and you show up with a certain hairstyle, especially in South Africa, you would get judged, and you would, during that interview, there would certainly be a bias against you because it doesn't quite fit with like the Anglo-Saxon ideal.
No, fully. There's an interesting stat that I think that links to that about how light-skinned men with dark-skinned men, black men with MBAs are less likely to acquire the employment opportunities that they apply for than light-skinned men with just undergrads. And I think that stat is super important in terms of the discussion around the policing of black bodies and the unconscious bias that goes into that policing, in terms of how it manifests in real-world detriments for these people, because that stat alone shows that even in the category of people of color, unconscious bias still determines an intersectional hierarchy of how we discriminate against them as a society. So the fact that light-skinned black men who are still black men can have some degree of privilege over dark-skinned black men who are also still within the broad category of black men is so absurd to me, because if we exist in a racist society, the unnuanced take on that would be that we are going to be like the society will exist as like in a blanket racist way. But no, bigotry and unconscious bias seems to manifest in a weirdly nuanced way of more bigotry, more social compartmentalization and limitations for a certain category than this other category, even though we don't like either categories, type of thing, in terms of the social messaging and social attitudes. And I think in terms of like black hair, for instance, and especially the hair of black women in schools, it comes down to that Anglo-Saxon ideal that you mentioned, which, if that's all that the people who get to pull the levers of power in society know, is the Anglo-Saxon idea of professionalism, of being neat. Not that I think schools should even have any control
I just
over
want to
your
say
body.
that no, dress codes are ridiculous.
Just a disclaimer, schools need to stop doing that. Let your kids do whatever if they want with their bodies in general. But if we're gonna police people, which we shouldn't, at least be unbiased about that policing, right? And what we see with black girls especially is it may not be neat to an Anglo-Saxon ideal to a white teacher for a girl to have her fro out, her natural hair out. It may not be neat to have braids and box braids and so on. That is you. That is you as a white instructor, as a white person with some degree of power within the hierarchy that you exist in. And if your unconscious bias informs your limited ideal of what professionalism looks like, and that's exactly what this is the unconscious and conscious, honestly, bias of white instructors and educators in this country, if that's what it is, then we have serious work to do. And I mean, that's why it's such an important hot topic in terms of the discussion around, I guess where South African feminism is really, especially when we talk about black women. Hair is such an important part of that. And I mean, schools are the prime example of where that goes haywire.
Yeah, they completely disregard people.
Yeah, no, fully. So, yeah, I think that's super important, definitely.
Yes. Coming back to what you said earlier about the police service, I think it's interesting that in South Africa, the majority of our police service are people of color. Would you say that same bias translates there as well, or would you say it's less frequent? Where I'm referring to the example where you spoke about people getting pulled over for speeding fines.
Right.
Do you think if that's a person of color officer pulling that same person over, do you think in the South African context that would make a difference, or do you think that it's become so kind of set in our way, we've gone so set in our ways that that person would act the same way on the grounds of unconscious bias, because you were taught in police academy that, like, no, people of color are more dangerous, they're more likely to be criminals, even if you are a person of color.
Yeah. So I just want to, like, clarify a few things with that, because that scenario, for instance, is one in which I could see people wanting to jump to a certain very simplistic conclusion of, oh, but if it's a black cop, like, the likelihood for bias has been minimized, right? Surely. I think firstly it depends what bias we're talking about, right? Because if we're talking about racial bias specifically, that we can very blatantly see with white police officers, if we're talking about racial bias specifically, I can't tell you what the difference becomes. I would imagine that a black person who is within, or any POC for that matter, who's in the police force, I would imagine that they understand, or at least have the lived experience to avoid racial biases more than a white cop. I think that's fairly safe to say. It's, again, I'm not speaking about universal experiences here.
Yeah.
It's just what I would perceive based on my knowledge of this.
It's just we see so much police brutality in this country that
Absolutely.
I feel like there's definitely a correlation there.
Then I think the bias might shift then, and also this is just like closer again. But so this is also like from my, I can't speak on it once again. Like I'm not a person of color, but I think then the bias might shift from categorizing someone based on like their racial identity to then shifting the bias that then like becomes prominent might be is this person that I've pulled over poor, or do they look like they are a person of means? Do they look like they are like, are they cisgendered presenting, are they heteronormative presenting, like what? Then I think that becomes the shift, because I don't think that suddenly there's no bias in the situation, but I then just think that the bias that is most prevalent then shifts.
Yeah. If I can jump in there, if the US has a pandemic of police brutality against people of color that is an explicitly racist pandemic, it is racist at its core, then I think what South Africa has is a pandemic of police brutality on the grounds of gender, especially.
Yes.
I don't know
thing
that
too.
race is necessarily where we see the bias of the police force navigating, or not navigating, but gravitating rather towards it. There are definitely probably racialized and racist examples of abuse of power from the police. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure black on black violence from police officers on citizens exists too, and that there's bias that goes into that too. While it might not be racial bias, it could certainly be class bias. I'm sure there are police officers who unconsciously have huge stigmatizations of poor people, black or otherwise, and that will manifest as violence. But I think our primary pandemic in terms of police brutality is the gendered violence that we see on that front. I, as a queer person who's had to have engagements with the police force, like, I didn't want to, but I had to. I've experienced huge amounts of violence from them. Misgendering, for starters. Like completely downplaying the violence that I experienced, that I needed the police protection for. Taking months with my case because it just felt like they didn't care about what I'd lived through, stuff like that. And that's not a solo experience for me. Black women, especially in this country, know what that feels like. I have black female friends who have been brutalized by the police. They were told, I will sexually harass you, I will hurt you, I will abuse you, by these, like in this case, men who have power. So to answer your question, yes, there's definitely unconscious bias within our police force. If it's not the racialized and racist version that we see in the US, it's certainly many other forms of unconscious bias. And that's the breeding ground for the most explicit and violent and harmful manifestations of unconscious bias.
I think we also have to, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Sure.
Thank you for that explanation. I just think we have to also take into account that a lot of the police officers on the force were trained in the previous regime.
That's an important
And
nuance,
I think a lot of those training methods also spilled over, maybe not consciously, but as a young policeman, you're working under this colonel who's been in the force for 40 years. You're going to trust what that person tells you. And you're going to try and please them. So I feel like maybe that also plays a role, but like Xander said, we can't really speak to that. I think we're going to have to get to the end of our podcast here. So, as a last thing, Giuseppe, thank you so much, firstly, for attending. I think we've all learned a lot from you, and it was wonderful to speak with you.
Thank you for having me, guys. Yeah.
As a last thing, could you maybe just give us your 3 main tips for establishing and sorting out your own unconscious bias?
Right. Okay.
Just
like
a recap.
quick fire
Thank you.
round. Sure. Yeah. So firstly, stop fighting the fact that you have unconscious bias. Just let go of that. Don't be afraid of it. Sit in it. Recognize I have unconscious biases. So acceptance, I guess, if we run through it in like that kind of step format. Accept that you have unconscious biases. Secondly, do exercises to identify where your unconscious biases manifest. So the friend group exercise, certain thought experiments like the doctor one that I used with you guys today. There are a bunch of other ones like that. Do certain exercises to try and identify that. Thirdly, do the remedying processes. So there's 3 steps within that. 1, Well, the obvious one is counter-consume, so that has to do with media and the content that you consume as a person. Counter-consume.
And you're going to provide us with that lovely list,
With
sorry.
the recommendation, sure. Counter-consume. Secondly, call yourself out and the people around you out. Correct yourself constantly, always, and the people around you. And thirdly, spend that week of taking in everything around you. Force your brain to not be lazy. Force your brain to recognize everything around it and to force the unconscious into the conscious. Because once you start pushing things from your unconscious brain into your conscious mind, that's when you can identify it. So do that week-long exercise. Then once you've done all of those recommendations and so on, then take it from there. So start changing elements of your life that have made you the person you are today. Whether that's the content you consume, whether that's your willingness to call people out, if you're more fearless about that now, take those steps now to change your life once you've identified your unconscious biases and actively tried to remedy them. And you'll be good.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Xander, would you like to say something as a final thought?
I think Giuseppe's tips perfectly sums it up. I don't really think that I have anything worthwhile to add to that, so yeah.
Okay, on behalf of Aurora, thank you so much for coming, both of you. Thank you for your inputs, and I look forward to working with you again in the future.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
guys so
much.
much.
Thank you.
This is the end of the first Aurora Radio podcast. Just have to throw that in there. That was really exciting.
I feel like it's illegal taking these all.
Oh my gosh, well done.
I feel like I definitely learned a lot today.
I'm glad.
Thank you. And I feel like if people listen to this, they will also get to learn a lot.
I hope so. That went over time more than I expected,
Oh,
but I didn't really feel it.
No. I was like, oh, how long have we been talking? And
yeah,
then I realized
it was like hour 15 or something. I was like, what?
I
It's
couldn't
wild.
see.